Okay, so brace yourself. I'm going to try and draw again my drawing package, and I'm going to try and draw kind of the whole shebang of how this works of your your biological brain, your the hardware, the software. Talk about the cultural download, social identity, and your symphonic self expressing through it. What the hell are you talking about, Mark? Okay, well, maybe a diagram will help. So let me try and swap over to the software and we'll have a go at this here. Okay, this is pretty comical, but we'll talk through it. So this is what I call the veil, or this is the box as I call it, what you perceive as reality. But let's talk about this is maybe an eye, a mouth, a head, and a brain in here. Less space because we need to break this out. So my perception um, is from being able to look back from here. This is your symphonic self outside of reality, outside the box, the non-local consciousness, whatever words we want to put on it right now. Uh, this, so this computer, this biological computer is what I'm calling it. This is um, what constructs what you perceive as reality. You're sitting there listening to me and looking around, right? It's a computer that's it's like a virtual reality headset that's creating it, or a television set if you want to think it that way. Um, so it's connected to here. You just can't see the connection. So a question that I often get from people who've done more science or physics and stuff is, well, how does that work then? If why can't you see it? And I'll give this answer, but actually the real answer is a lot more complicated, so I need to go off to the right. Um, the answer is that everything inside the box, every point particle, if you study quantum physics, is quantum entangled to your symphonic self out here. So everything that is happening, all the information, or if you like, or everything that's happening here is also happening, or that information is effectively also occurring over here. Um, so this just sort of relates to another question. It's not, well, maybe I don't want to get in this video, but um, so when you die, like people say, well, I've studied near death and all people that have, for example, been declared brain dead and but come back to life, and all these cases. Where in what they all see the same thing pretty much, is that when they die, they they see themselves as sort of a glowing ball above their body, and then are aware that they kind of leave this box basically and they go to somewhere, and they don't really have again a frame of reference. But the somewhere they're going is here. We could call this the quantum entangled non-local domain. Josh was asking me about this, my son, one of my sons, and I said to him, yeah, but that's so what happens is sometimes people can come back, like, so their body is somehow they're able to sort of resuscitate them even though they've been brain dead and their heart stopped and their brain's been had no activity for say for half an hour. And there's been lots of these cases that have been studied. I've got I can refer to some books if you want to read about it. Um, and then they're just suddenly back here, but they're aware that there's also somewhere that if they went past it that they can't come back, and that's off to the right here. So what's interesting is that people, when they die, you'll see these videos all over the internet actually, if you look this up, and they're like, well, when I died, I saw Jesus, or I saw Buddha, or I saw a family member, or I saw my favorite dog. Everybody seems to see something different. Some people see similar things, but they're all sort of on different themes. And so if you study this, what they're seeing is largely what again called polymorphic. It relates to where they are, what they perceive they're going to see when they die, largely. Sometimes it's not, but mostly. But that's because they're here. They're not really dead, they're not fully dead. That's why if they, if they were, they wouldn't be able to come back. You're only fully, truly dead when you go off to the right here. And what's off to the right is what I've talked about in the initial video, is your truth and symphonic self. So I'm simplifying when I've been talking about this because I didn't want to get into this. So really, this quantum entangled non-local consciousness, okay, I know it's throwing some terms and we'll have to go through it, but you have a quantum entangled non-local consciousness that is outside of this box, this reality that you're in, and is the observer that is observing yourself here. And when you die, you are aware of that. But there's also another, the symphonic self is off to the right that is observing that, but you don't have awareness of here. So people think, oh, well, I died, I'm going to get the absolute truth, but it doesn't work like that. Like, this isn't the truth just because your non-local consciousness, your quantum entangled non-local consciousness isn't the truth. It's just the part of yourself that's the observer. That's what you're seeing when you air quotes die. Now, if you went further and you go to the light of what people say, or then you would have a different perception, but you couldn't come back and tell everybody in these near-death experiences. So I think that's a good way of kind of explaining that from things that have been, essentially that's observational evidence there. So when I'm really talking about the symphonic self, I'm talking about what's over here, and also the collective, how these are all connected. I've talked about the individual cells, but they're all connected like your body. This is all off to the right. Anyway, coming back to this, so what's here? How does this relate to your identity? So let's start over here. You don't exist right now in this domain. You're going to be born. What happens is, right furthest to the right in the symphonic domain, as I'm calling it, you are created. You are created here first, okay? And you're created by two of these symphonic cells, who are essentially already here as your parents, connected as your parents, but they're here. I don't have a strong enough perception to really make this understood, but I think actually it often is other. There's connections to others. So you can be born to two. In here, you can have parents, biological parents, but they might not be your symphonic parents. So that's weird, right? But that is my understanding. It's not a strong one, but that's why you can get someone here and you're like, my God, how can that be your child, or how can that be your parents? This is partly why. I don't fully comprehend this and how that's working, but this is the case. But there is, well, let's go through it a step at a time. So you are created here first, but now you need a body here. So your parents here, your biological parents, who are connected also over here. This is going to get complicated. They create the DNA, the code. So they create the DNA code through, well, everyone knows how that works, so hopefully I don't need to explain that, but so it starts with a single cell here, has the DNA, and then the cell copies itself, and it copies the DNA into the cell. Now, something, if you haven't studied kind of genetics or whatever, you might not be aware, there's a very complicated issue here, is how does as these cells keep dividing, how do they know what they're supposed to become? That's a very good question. But I'm not going to go into that here, but that is indeed where it could possibly tie to your symphonic self. But eventually this creates the body. So a lot of people don't understand this, that DNA is mostly used to construct your body and figure out what as these cells divide, what are they going to become? Okay, to think of it as the DNA is sort of the code that constructs like a factory your body. But once the body's constructed, the DNA is less important actually, relatively, than what we call gene expression and epigenetics. But we'll go into that separately. It's sort of a code on top of this code. So now you've got this brain. It's brain constructed of, so we've got neural nets. They're like, a neuron is a nerve cell, and it has tentacles out of it. Most people have studied this, and then they all connect to each other. And then if you look at this at a high level, you're like, well, that's what's happening. This is how the brain works. This is neural net. So this is a good place to say that no, that is wrong. That is not true. The brain is not a neural net. This is like, I'll draw it down here. If you look at Earth and you looked at Earth from space, and that dot there represents Los Angeles. From space, Los Angeles would look like one light with some lines on the major roads coming out. But if you went down and down and down close enough, you would see that Los Angeles, that one light, was actually made up of millions and millions of lights. This is what's happening with neurons. Neurons are what we call resultants, or whatever, that of information of something at a much lower level. And what's at a lower level is a quantum computer, a quantum level storage and processing of information. We know this because studies have shown, and attempts in doing AI through neural nets didn't work. And the reason it didn't work is that the amount of what we call information. So like here, if you looked at this one light, you'd say, well, it's just one light there. But if you could observe how much information was going on, you would realize, well, that it's millions of times more, because it turns out that light is made up of millions of lights. And it's the same thing with the brain. The amount of information it's processing can't be explained just from neurons, and it's because it's actually down. A neuron is like a city that is representing all this information at a quantum level. Now the trouble with that is that you can't, because of what's called the Heisenberg uncertainty, you can't really see what's going on in real time or observe a brain at a quantum level. So that's why things like consciousness is very difficult to observe. And that's an example of the veil that I talked about. But anyway, just touching on things as I go through. So, some people would say the brain is the same way as like a quantum computer. You could say it's an electromagnetic computer. I think that's less accurate, because electromagnetic waves are really comprised ultimately of quantum information, what is part of quantum fields. We will go over this separately. So you could say that, but it's less accurate. So the moment that first, a good question, I suppose, is the minute that first cell is conceived, are you alive? So this is an example of an unbounded question. I mean, it sounds like it's a good question, but we can't. It isn't. It's unbounded because we don't. What do you mean by alive? Define alive. We don't really know what life is. We can't give a mathematical bounded definition. We can, but I mean, we're just arbitrarily choosing it. So, from my symphonic perception, I can give my answer, but it's not the absolute answer. I would say no. You're alive. One cell is alive, but I have to go through this a bit, and then you will understand. By the time your full body is constructed, you have millions or billions or trillions of cells in your brain, right? So, let's say that you're going to end up with I don't know how many it is, a trillion cells are in your brain, and each of those cells, in a way, is quantum entangled to your symphonic self. At one cell, you're 1/trillionth of alive. At two cells, you're 2/trillionths of alive, and once you reach a trillion, you're 100%, or you could do a percentage. So I mean, yes, your one cell is alive, but it's a tiny fraction of the full being what you perceive to be alive when you're actually born and fully conscious. There's a term in computing that refers to this. That's called an emergent property. Okay, so consciousness or being alive, as I understand it from symphonic perception, is an emergent property of a biological computer, or body as well. It's just not just your mind. Obviously, it's your whole body, because your whole body is quantum entangled across here. It's not just the brain. I'm just going with this because it's what we were talking about, identity. Okay, I don't want to belabor these points, so I mean that'll do for that explanation for now. So, yes, even in the womb you have consciousness right from the beginning. Even a one-cell fetus essentially has consciousness, but it's just a trillionth of consciousness that you're going to have. There's a sort of philosophical debate. I remember having this with someone once. They were saying to me, am I saying that insects or amoeba are conscious then? And I said yes, if by consciousness you mean they're quantum entangled to a symphonic self that is an observer of themselves. They are, but their consciousness is just a trillionth again of human consciousness. It doesn't make it any. Does that mean it's not valid? I mean, no, it is what it is. Actually, even everything that's alive, so trees and plants and grass and even water and the earth itself, is also quantum entangled and has a symphonic self and has an observer observed. So you could say alive, it's just alive in a different way. Or this mysterious word consciousness, this is what consciousness means. So, who is to say, again, this discussion about at what point you deem that what most of us perceive alive, it's completely arbitrary. So I mean, it is what it is. As best I can explain it here, what you make of that is down to your own polymorphic, where you are in the journey. So do you have an identity at this point? Yes, you do. You have an identity. It's from your symphonic self to the far of the right here. Now this is where this gets. I probably shouldn't have started here, but when you're over here, should I go into this? I'm kind of committed now, haven't I? No, I really shouldn't, but I'll touch on it because the issue comes up of what is time. This is a favorite one. Time only exists in this domain, inside here. What is time? Time is a tough one. Time is the sequencing of events, or the flow of information in this domain. Now, if you look at it in physics, to the limit of what we can, you can slow time to nothing if you go down to absolute freezing. So you can see there that it's what we call depending on where you want to go with this, but it's to do with what we call quantum information or quantum entropy, state changes of quanta. It really doesn't matter for the point of discussion. The point for now is that time exists here as a way to allow us to experience a sequence of events, right? Whereas over here, we already have seen our entire, so this is very tough for us to perceive here. Once you develop symphonic perception over here, it's not. But it is, I remember myself, this is so difficult. Actually, when you're created here, you already perceive your entire existence over here. So before you even came here, you knew what your entire life experience is going to be, from so-called birth to death. Now, I know that seems really weird, but so I've tried to think of a way of explaining this. This actually relates to Einstein's theory of relativity. So why did Einstein say that time is a physical dimension? Because what I want you to imagine, I said here, is imagine you took a picture every second. Okay, well, you can take pictures any faster than any second. What's the fastest you could take pictures? Well, it's down to these what we call quantum state changes. So that if we could take a picture of the entire universe and where every piece of information, let's say, was in quantum physics, we could say every where every the state of every quantum field at the smallest quantum state change. Obviously, this would be you need a pretty big data cloud to hold this. um, Unimaginable, right? My cat is trying to Willow. What Willow? Willow's got something to say on that. She's an expert on quantum field theory. So, yeah, if you took those pictures and you laid them all out on a table, you could look at them all at once. You would be seeing, and you did that forever until the end of the universe. You would essentially see the universe from the Big Bang to the end of the universe, the big collapse maybe, but you could see it all at once. And this is the perception that you have over here. So you actually, this is one of the strongest perceptions I had from very young, and I'm absolutely certain of, is that you already basically chose your entire life experience before you came here on your symphonic side. And I know that sounds crazy, but it's true. You not only did you decide all the main things anyway. There's maybe a tiny bit of randomness, but virtually everything is kind of fate that happens to you as an experience that you chose to have over here, including who your parents are, a lot of your friends and people you meet and experiences you have. Yeah, maybe I shouldn't go into that anymore. There's a lot to talk about there, about all of that. Is it all fate then? I remember discussing with Nadia, a girl I met. If she ever hears this, she'll remember. And we were saying, well, but how can they, if it's all fated, if you've seen it all and you chose to come here and experience it, what was the point of that? The point of it is to go through that experience. It's very hard to explain that. Let me come back to that one. But how can there be free will then if everything is predetermined? Well, not everything is predetermined. So this is why you do it. So this is what I call the trains and the stations. So yes, you foresaw this in terms of a lot of main events and things that you're going to experience. But there's points in this journey, like a train going between stations, and at those points you don't know what's going to happen. That's the point of for this symphonic self of the experience, is to see what you do in the fork in the road at those specific points. And in my life, once I understood this and I observed myself and other people, I could see this. You really can learn to realize when you're standing on a station and at one of these decision points. So that is just to observe what you end up doing this time through. And as I said, you've actually done this many, many times, and you can take almost the same journey, but take the left path and the right path and then compare it. And as your symphonic self, you can compare it, and that's how you learn. You won't have an awareness of that in this domain each time. But that's really that really ultimately is what is going on. I mean, I've absolutely proven this to myself and other people. Like, it really is. And that's so, like, not all deja vus. Deja vu can be a property of what we call in digital electronics a critical race condition in the brain, where two or more paths set off and meet back up. But some deja vu that's different, and we can learn to identify it, which I'll talk about, is this awareness where you have taken the left path and now you're looking to take the right path. Okay, enough on that. But that's part of your identity. So now you're born. Okay, so I've gone over that at length. So you're born into this largely predetermined set of trains and stations that you're going to go on and observe what choices you make and how it's different to other times you did that, and make this contrast. You've got to contrast hot to cold, left to right. That's how we learn. And well, what about your biological brain? If I'm here to this be a scientist versus here to be a sportsman, then I'm gonna have a different. I need, if I'm gonna be doing like high level maths and stuff, I got to have a high IQ, right? So IQ highly correlates to math and whatever. It's not much use for anything else, and it doesn't make you smart, but it's good. It just like having a fast processor, it can still be garbage in, garbage out, but it means you're good at calculations. So yes, the biological, the DNA you had to provide the genetic computer, the biological computer that you needed. So there is a relationship there, and that relates to, as I said, the biological parents that you have to provide that genetic material could be different to what we could say spawned you over here. Um, what spawns you over here, I think, it's so different to what we experience here. It is related to often the two biological parents as well, but it could be not, as I said, could be involve thousands of other symphonic selves involved in a sort of collaborative mechanism over here. Um, I only get to it's actually much more involved than that. We'll have to start talking about fractals and all sorts of fun things. So, um, okay, so so you have this biological brain, and that biological brain obviously it limits and sort of. So here's what I have to give you to explain this. This is a beach here, and I got a bucket of water and I pour it into the sand, and it will form channels, right? You ever pour water through sand, it forms channels. And if the more you pour the water, once the channels have been formed initially, the water always wants to go through the channels. This is the most absolutely basic level. This is how the human um, the hardware of the human brain works. When you're a baby into childhood, say this is most true when you're a baby, but even up to sort of 5, 6, 7, your biological hardware here is very what we call fluid. Fluid in the sense that the water is flowing through the sand and forming new channels and different channels. It's not water, it's information that is coming into all your senses and information that you are processing. And forming these channels, and you could consider that learning. And then, but once you reach a sort of certain age, depending on who you are, 5, 6, 7, 8, these channels have been formed, and now all new information is kind of directed into those channels. So it's almost like you can't really learn. So what's going on there is that this is the adaptation of your biological hardware to your environment. So if you were born the same you, the symphonic you, the same biological hardware, you're born into 5,000-year-old Egypt built, and you're a slave building pyramids, the channels the sound would form would be completely different to you being born in a modern Western culture and what you're exposed to here. So that if we looked at the channels, the sound channels, if you like, in the brain of people through all time and different cultures, they would all be different based on what the adaptations that brain has made, that biology has made. And so that is once the channels are down, that is a strong part of what you're considering your identity, because as I said, once it's formed, adapted, all new information that you take in is kind of directed into these channels. I think Edward de Bono calls these freeways, or an A and B roads. But we won't go deep into this right now because I'd have to break that down. We have to spend like a good amount of time on it. But I just want to give you this basic idea. But the thing is that it's not just the biology; it's your symphonic self. So this if you took identical twins with identical biological computers, they and then they're exposed to identical adaptation to environment, they still form different channels. And this is proof of the symphonic self. And it's so ironic that, well, ironic, but it was sort of joke to me because I ended up having identical twins, and they don't run in my family or anyone. And everyone was like, who knows me well, was like, well, yeah, of course you did. So you, and I said, it's just when I was thinking about this is a classic example of my symphonic self, was to see that because I could tell even in the 20 weeks in the womb that my uh, identical twins had these distinct symphonic personalities. I knew what they were, and I said them to my wife, and that is indeed what they are, and they became. And I didn't, completely objective in my treatment of them, but it was obvious right from the beginning that they were. So I know for absolute certain, as I did already, but the fact that I then had these twins at that moment, to see that this was the case. That so yes, you could call that your soul, your spirit. I call it your symphonic self. It's expressing through that biological brain, but even with identical biological brains, the channels that are formed that part of your identity. So it's sort of like, that's a way we could, it's sort of like you're animating a puppet. If the puppets are identical, you still animate them differently with your distinct personality. And obviously there is a much more similarity in identical twins, even with different symphonic selves in their channels. They're closer, but they're still unique. They're what we call a fractal. So like I said, a fractal is a pattern that is very templated, similar. So snowflakes or leaves, you always know what a snowflake is and a leaf because they're similar, but they're also unique. And this is true of this situation. Okay, now we have to bring in, so what we need words for that. So so I call it, so your symphonic self expressing through this adaptation. So I call that your biological ID, your biological identity, you could call that. And then what happens is that you're exposed to your parents, friends, and then your culture, your school. Culture is the patterns, essentially identities of everybody else. So if you're an American culture, or I always use these extremes, Islamic culture or Chinese culture or Russian culture, you're exposed to that. That is water flowing through these pre-existing channels now, and it's a certain amount of water, if you like, in a certain way it's going to form new channels off of these, right? So it does form some new channels, and they're all going to be very similar. That's why you have culture, because it's going to form some new channels. It's not like this has no fluidity. So it forms new channels that are very similar between everybody in their culture, but there's unique differences because you've already established this symphonic and bio channels here, this unique combination that I went over just now. Okay, and so I call that your cultural identity. Cultural identity, because you don't really have any free will in that. In your first sort of 5-7 years, you're being exposed to that, and those channels are getting laid down also, right? So you're still in this fluid time frame. If you take like these cases of children that lived in the wild and never were exposed to that, it's almost impossible to easily acquire their cultural identity at that point. They're sort of like, they usually imprint like someone's brought up by wolves or whatever to whatever was in their culture, if you like. And I talked about your social ID. So once you get older, so it's 10 plus, you're still being exposed to water still coming in. You're still being exposed to things and everything in your life, but you've already established these things. So that's also directing, the patterns. You can't lay down new patterns so well, but you're sort of etching these out in your new ways. And then you develop this, what I call social identities. You try to fit in to your culture and your life experience. So we can call that your social ID. God, this is so hard to write with. So there's sort of layers. The social ID sits on the cultural ID, which sits on top of your biological ID, which is an expression, part biological and part expression of your symphonic self. As I said, that identical twin situation. It's sort of like layers of an onion, you know? So an important thing to understand here is that most people's biological computer is, I said, in this binary mode. Like 90% of people, I don't know, that hasn't been studied extensively, but so that's going to direct these channels in a certain way. They're all going to be, very, more similar than people who don't have that. So the key difference between the 90% and the 10% I talk about, I'm not saying neither is better, it's not a competition, but the real difference is that the 90% of people, this is true of them, these patterns get, I call, locked down, sort of 7, 8. They tend to, form very similar in their culture and their social idea, their social circles, and they can't really change it. The other 10%, particularly 1% I talk about, there's a difference in their biological computer where their patterning here is their sand, if you like, is more fluid, what we call, has higher plasticity, and so they can keep changing it as they go through, and they are able at some point to challenge and change their own patterns. This is what I mean when I say this word introspection. So they're able to sort of examine these patterns and change them as they're older in life, whereas that's not really biologically possible for most people, 90% of people. So whatever happens in childhood essentially defines their identity, and that's it. Give it his primary socialization. Say Parsons, give me the child at 7 and I'll show you the man. That's true, but only for the majority, not for everyone. Some divergent people, this is the divergence, is their brains are has higher plasticity even through adulthood, and so that is not true, and they tend to change, and they tend to diverge more and more and more from their own culture and social ID until they feel like they, totally, like, air quotes, unrelated to even their own family or other people. So that is what is going on at a very high level anyway. Obviously I'm leaving out incredible amounts of detail. So that is, your identity. So is it your identity? Well, 90% of people's identity is essentially just cultural programming and social programming that went through here, and essentially biology from the inherited biological computer. But as I said, this ties completely to your symphonic self and where you are. So as you move towards the end of the intellectual chasm and crossing to connect it, to actually be able to have this perception looking back. We're all experiencing the symphonic self all the time, but actually connect to that perception so you, air quotes, can see what's going on as I'm describing here. You require a brain that's going to be able to have more and more of this introspection, more of this plasticity, more of this self-questioning, more of this fluidity, whatever you want to call it. And you still have to work on it, you still have to do the work, but you have that potential there. And this is why it's sort of meaningless, and people say, well, I don't get it. Why can't people see, air quotes, see this point of view, or why can't they question this? Well, this is why. This is the answer. Okay, it's known in brain biology. This is the answer. And, I other videos I could break it down. We'll go into it much more, but this is in essence the answer of how this works. But even in the most completely locked down, socially, culturally programmed person, there's still a unique expression of their symphonic self through that, as I've gone through here. But it can't express as much, obviously. It's like putting it in a straitjacket, right? Okay, I probably should stop this video here. I hope that made some sense. I mean, it's very difficult to explain these ideas. I probably have to go through it and say it in different ways, in many different ways. And plus, I'm absolutely horrendous at drawing. In some ways, I think I'd be better with a flip chart and a pen. It's quite difficult on the computer, but there's my first shot at it. We'll go through these things in more detail over time. All right, take care.